Stuart. It's one small step for Hot Press, one giant leap for mankind.
Here we go.
The inaugural
first ever podcast.
Hot Press Classics pod.
Tell you what next.
We're so pretty. Oh, so pretty. Coming up next, it's Nevermind The Bollocks. Stuart, this album, Nevermind The Bollocks, I mean, in terms of like our shared musical tastes, I mean, it's an album we've probably discussed, I would say, a few times in the Hot Press offices over the years. Like I say, I think in terms of the Venn diagram of what we're both into, it's right there in the middle. Certainly an album we both love. But I mean, you were there right in the middle of it as a punk fan, as a teenager in the late 70s in England. I mean, when you think of the influence this album has had on, you know, not just music, but art, film, books, the whole lot of it, could you have imagined nearly 50 years later this, you know, this would have had the impact it's had?
Strangely, yes. Okay, I was 13. I was ready for it. What happened to me was, you know, I started getting into music in 1972. So I had Bowie and Roxy Music and Alice Cooper and Sparks and Hawkwind, who are quite important to this tale. And I was going, wow, this is great. It's always like this. And then sort of 3 years later, I'm going like, ELO, really? Nothing happened. Just nothing happened. These bands got older and less relevant. They went off to the States. Like, I know now that what Bowie did was genius, but I felt completely betrayed by him going to the States and doing this plastic soul thing. Dr. Feelgood were the one sort of bright light, but it was just dirge. So I was waiting for something to happen, like most of England at the time, and by God, it happened.
I mean, there's a lot always made of this idea of the social and political tumult in England at the time and how the Pistols and punk generally sort of draw on that and reflect that in the music. I mean, were you aware of that at the time? Was that feeling in the air?
Look, I've got to admit, I was living in Sevenoaks in Kent, which is conservative with a small and big C. Mm-hmm. So I was suffering from, you know, middle-class guilt. But I was going to football matches and being handed these Combat 18 leaflets with some horrible pictures, you know, people being lynched, black people being lynched. I was in London one day at Charing Cross, the next thing about 1,000 National Front sort of like skinheads march past, bottles breaking in their wake, and just, it was horrible. You know, it was like sort of Millwall Football Club and NF all merged into one. Not that all Millwall supporters, I hasten to add, are racist, but there was a strong overlap there. So I was aware that things weren't very nice, that there were tensions. I didn't understand the minutiae of it, but it felt like a very violent, nasty place and a boring place. I just remember those years in black and white, funnily enough. And as I say, there was a real sense of expectation that something had to happen. But I had no idea what. I was buying Enemy and Sounds of Melody Maker, and I saw little one-line mentions of the Sex Pistols. And to a 13, 14-year-old kid, that sounded quite sort of edgy and a bit naughty and a bit this, that, the other. But of course, you know, I had to wait for their TV debut before I fully realised what I was dealing with. And that was just an incredible light being switched on moment.
So which was the TV appearance you saw?
December the 1st, 1976, the Today Show. It was a news magazine. It had several presenters, including Bill Grundy, who's now no longer with us. And Bill would get a little over-refreshed. You know, he would slur his way in. He was a bit of an Alan Partridge, albeit with a real sort of potty mouth. And the story is famous. They went looking for Queen. Queen couldn't make it, so they wanted a musical guest for the show. So EMI said, we got a new band called the Sex Pistols. We'll send them round. So my dad had just got home from work, and we sat down there. And looking back now at what happened, it was really quite tame. There was a "you rotter" and a couple of swear words, but nothing compared to what you'd see now on Graham Norton or something like that. It was really tame. But of course, my dad made the schoolboy error of saying, no child of mine will ever bring a Sex Pistols record into this house. So naturally, by 10:30 the next morning, I'd mitched off school and gone down to W.H. Smith's and bought Anarchy in the UK, which I played really loudly to annoy him, and it did annoy him incredibly for about 6 months.
That has to be, I mean, to get Anarchy in the UK at that age, that has to be, you know, one of the most incredible like musical experiences you can have, really. You know, the perfect age, the perfect time, a record like that, you know.
For once in my life, I was in the right place at the right time. Yeah. Now, look, I'm sure if I'd have been in London and heard The Who's My Generation or The Small Faces 2 or 3 years later, I'd have had the same sort of, you know, tingle up and down the spine. And I can look at other artists since and see why they mean as much to kids as the Pistols meant to me. But there's nothing quite as exciting as being 13 or 14 and discovering your band. Now, the Pistols were everybody else's band, but to me, it was like my band, my discovery. It was that real tribalism that this is, you know. Then the Clash came along, and I was kind of conflicted between the two, but it was okay to like both. Yeah. But yeah, the Pistols, even to this day, as much as I adore Joe Strummer, that moment of hearing Anarchy in the UK, I can smell and feel what it was like to be that age. It has an enormous visceral effect on me still when I hear the intro. Yeah,
I mean, it's just one of the most electrifying pieces of rock and roll you could ever hear. So around this time, I mean, do you start going to like punk gigs later? I mean, you went to the Sex Shop, of course, Vivian Westwood and Malcolm McLaren.
Well, I went into it for about 5 seconds. I was very cherubic. I was a bit plump, still am. Yeah. But I had a mad sort of like halo of golden curls and really was not hip or a street kid. But I was really into punk. So I thought, I'll go into the Sex Shop and buy some. I had my birthday money. I sort of walked in and I remember just seeing Jordan with the massive hair and the Bodicea look, so staring at me. It's like, who the fuck are you? And I was so scared I had to sort of turn around and leave. And I actually, Jordan has fascinated me. It was very, very sad last year when she passed away. The next time I saw her, when I started going to gigs, was in the Marquee for Adam and the Ants, who were obviously part of that scene. And this was when they were a serious hardcore S&M band. I mean, the crowd was just like scary. These were real serious S&M heads. Yeah. And basically Adam came on in a gimp mask on all fours, dressed in leather. Yeah. Jordan was whipping his back with a riding crop and sticking her ridiculous stiletto heels into his back, and you could see the welts. Yeah. And she was just kicking the crap out of him. Yeah. And I thought she was marvellous, you know, and I kind of secretly wanted a girlfriend like her. But she would have broken me probably in about 2 or 3 minutes. So I never saw the Pistols. I was in the Screen on the Green once when it was having like a punk night, and it was like Sodom and Gomorrah. I mean, it just stunk to high heaven. But yeah, I was able to kind of, I was living, say, 15 minutes away, half an hour away maximum from London. So I was able to sort of mitch off and go and see bands. And you know, again, punk history is quite revisionist. As a London boy, the likes of Menace and Johnny Moped meant as much to me as the Sex Pistols and the Clash. History has airbrushed them out, but like the X-Ray Specs, the Slits, they're all massive. But you would see the characters around. I used to go to Bonaparte Records in both Croydon and Bromley. And I remember being in Bonaparte Records one day and seeing Susie, and another time seeing Billy Idol, the Bromley contingent. And actually Bonaparte Records were very naughty boys and girls because they were selling the Spunk bootleg, which was the bootleg version of Nevermind The Bollocks. So I had a very good idea what to expect before it came out, although the Spunk bootleg didn't have the wall of sound. Yeah. And that obviously lifted the songs 1,000%. Yeah.
I mean, it's fascinating, you know, just the interest that successive generations have in this album and in the Sex Pistols. I got into them it was spring going into summer 2000, which was when Julian Temple's Filth and the Fury documentary came out. And it was, I used to come into city centre from Kildare on Saturdays, and, you might look around a record shop or a bookshop, then go see some movies. On that particular Saturday, I saw Filth and the Fury and Paul Thomas Anderson's Magnolia and the one afternoon, which is about as good an afternoon of film going as you could ask for. But, subsequently, like, you'd read about the film and the Pistols in Uncut, and I bought the soundtrack then. And, listening to all those songs, Anarchy in the UK, Pretty Vacant, God Save the Queen, I mean, they still sounded as powerful to me, like nearly 25 years on, as they would have to people who were there at the time, which was incredible,
They really haven't aged. And of course, it was the excitement of the singles, Anarchy first, then God Save the Queen, then Pretty Vacant. And actually, I reckon topping them all was Holidays in the Sun. At the time, I didn't think so, but I listen to Holidays in the Sun now, I think musically it's just incredible. But it was the perfect storm, because we were being force-fed all this kind of monarchy, malarkey. Now, I'll be honest, as a little nipper, I was all into that. I went to the Royal Tournament. I was about 5 feet away from the Queen. Prince Charles came to my school in 1975 to open the new sports centre. I was quite the royalist. But then as I just sort of started hearing about stuff, for me, as a middle-class kid, and suddenly I was mixing with kids who were from council estates. I was reading fanzines. I was reading stuff in the NME, and I was kind of going, oh my God, there's a whole other world. And a real pivotal moment was the Clash Rock Against Racism rally in Brixton. And you're having people on sort of stage saying, we need volunteers to go down Brick Lane because the Bangladeshis are being attacked by skinheads. And I was going to sign up. Wouldn't have been much use, to be honest, battling Combat 18 skinheads down Brick Lane. But I was picking up fanzines, I was getting the Rock Against Racism magazine, and suddenly the scales were lifted from my eyes, and I was kind of going, there's a whole other world out there. And it's not very just, but also in a perverse way, it's quite exciting. So, it was like overload central. There was the music, but the politics and this realization of what was going on. And suddenly the Queen, the monarchy was parasitical. So I was really ready for what I think kids nowadays, I feel sorry for them. They have to really try hard to upset their parents or society. You can walk around in anything. People go, geez, that's fine. But I was the least threatening looking person. But wearing a Pistols T-shirt, having a pair of homemade PVC trousers made out of dustbin liners, which weren't very practical, so you had to wrap yourself up in chains, and you had to go to the toilet. Then it was like, how do I do this? But little old ladies would cross the street and tut. And as a 13 or 14-year-old kid, you want little old ladies to cross the street and tut-tuts. Yeah. That's what you're trying to do. So the shock value was just fantastic.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, there's certain artists, like, I think Nirvana fall into this category as well. And it's just that thing of when you're a teenager, and I certainly felt it listening to the Sex Pistols, you want something with that bite to it, and that's kind of lashing out at the world a bit, And even now, I mean, you see so many like Nirvana T-shirts all over the place all the time, and there's a similar feeling around the Sex Pistols, and there is that enduring interest in them and in that scene. I mean, it's nearly half a century later now, and we have the Pistol TV series. I mean, what did you make of that?
I was expecting to hate it. And
really?
It is obviously a panto version. But then again, the Pistols were a kind of a panto in some ways. Look, I was never part of their inner circle. But the look and feel of London, they kind of get right. It was very interesting because I got to talk to Maisie Williams and to Danny Boyle beforehand. And Maisie Williams made a really good point. I mean, she was obviously not born when punk happened. And she was kind of intrigued. She saw a photograph of Jordan and thought, God, playing her would be amazing. That sucked her in. But her first thoughts were, it was a very macho. And you can look at the Pistols from distance and think, oh, it was very, very macho. But no, there are so many strong female characters in their orbit or responsible for them, you could argue. I mean, Vivienne Westwood. I mean, what a woman. I find her endlessly fascinating. Jordan, whose own book is just, I think it's called Defying Gravity. It's fascinating in talking about the really early origins of the Pistols and punk, which is through the London gay scene in Soho, Madame Jojo's, stuff that I didn't know about. Her mate, Sue Catwoman, Susie, of course, and Chrissie Hynde, who had jetted in from Akron, Ohio. I hadn't realised till recently, actually, that she was down for the bass playing gig when they sacked Matlock, and was really upset when it went to Sid Vicious, who famously couldn't play a note. Yeah. Chrissie had sort of heard about the punk scene in London and decided to come across. She was fired not once but twice by Johnny Moped, who was a wonderful character from Croydon, where I was born. And I loved to this day Johnny Moped, who means as much to me as Lydon or Strummer. And it's been airbrushed out of her kind of CV, but herself and Steve Strange formed a band called the Moors Murderers, which again was kind of part of the reason punk sort of went wrong.
It's like totally tasteless, They
didn't really get the point. It was meant to be a little bit more sort of subtle or playful than that. It's like one of my favourite bands, and I cannot nowadays stand over their name, was a band called Raped, who were fronted by a guy from Galway called Sean Purcell, who unfortunately died recently. And I still have his taffeta scarf, because they changed then into a glam band called Cuddly Toys when they got really bad press. I'm sort of going off the point, but it's just there were so many bands and so many characters around the place. Chrissie was one of them. So there were so many strong women. Yeah,
well, definitely. I mean, and it's really interesting that you point out that Maisie saw in it this kind of feminist strand, which was there strongly. I mean, I remember seeing an interview with Chrissie where she was talking about, I mean, she kind of basically moved to London to be around the punk scene, didn't she?
She did.
Yeah, and it was that idea of non-discrimination, and then she subsequently gets started, goes into the Pretenders, fantastic band. I mean, the Pistols TV show, I find Danny has gotten a bit almost like more opaque or arty in his storytelling laterally. I found out with Trainspotting 2, the sequel to Trainspotting, maybe didn't have the sort of visceral power of Trainspotting, the original, but there was some great stuff in the series. Anson Boone, who played Johnny Rotten, I thought was fantastic, did a great job.
Oh, the lad who played Malcolm McLaren was just totally uncanny.
Yeah.
Danny did admit that he was more of a Clash fan, but found the story fascinating, and being part of it, wanted to tell it properly. And like I say, it's funny, on one hand, there was that pantomime thing that Malcolm manipulated. But on the other hand, Steve and Paul and Wally were in a band. They were nicking the gear for it famously. And I think from what I've ascertained, that's actually true and not sort of revisionist. And I got to meet McLaren in about 1985.
Oh, right, yeah.
And a bit like Tony Wilson, he could sell snow to an Eskimo, and you knew he was playing you, but you were sucked into it.
Yeah.
Very charming man and incredibly charismatic.
Did you interview him? Or?
I did. Yeah. And he said, look, I may have made some awful mistakes, but I never set out to actually hurt anybody. I did hurt people, because I was never trying to be malicious. And it is interesting, how much were the Pistols his creation and plaything. One thing I always found a bit odd with their early TV interviews was that the band would sit around looking bored, seething behind him, and Malcolm would speak on their behalf. And that happened quite a bit with their first TV appearances. And I don't think there's been any other band really in history where the talking was done. So that sort of added to the myth or lore that he had put them together piecemeal. But I think as history sort of goes on, we realise that probably without McLaren, the Pistols would have happened in some form, but certainly the punk revolution would have happened, because there are other people with the same ideas. It mightn't have been called punk. It might have unfolded differently, but there was genuinely around the country, more so I think in the provinces, awful word to use, but more so in Manchester and Liverpool, it was much more street, I think, than it was in London, where it was quite art college.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's one thing we'll probably dive into a bit further is this, constant warring over who who deserves the most credit for the Sex Pistols?
Yes.
But it's interesting having talked to Glen, and we're going to talk to Glen a bit after we're finished chatting. But he started working in the sex shop. That was his sort of entree into the punk scene. Was working in there, and he used to go through like McLaren's address book, and like everyone who was notorious in London was into it. It was like IRA gangsters. He reckoned subsequently Hot Press might have been in that book as well. But I mean,
it was enormously entertaining,
yeah.
if dangerous, to walk down the King's Road at the weekend,
yeah.
because it was a spectator sport.
Yeah.
I mean, as a 14-year-old kid or whatever, but you were a target. I mean, obviously Lydon was the king of the punks and got razored and attacked. But I always remember coming out of a Clash gig. It was the Give 'Em Enough Rope tour in the Lyceum. Me and Rob Endersby, he was fairly angelic too, and we sort of came out with Rock Against Racism badges. And about half a dozen really massive Combat 18 skins ripped our badges off, spat at us, and were about to kick the shit out of us.
Right.
And thank God about a dozen real grown-up punks came out behind us. I think they made a bit of history with them, and they just tore off and like lashed into these guys.
Yeah.
And we ran away. I remember being in the roundhouse for the adverts in Sham 69 and being caught in a sham riot where a load of Combat 18, National Front, goons just stormed the doors.
Yeah.
And for about 10 or 15 minutes, we were like, me and Rob Endersby again, holed up in the toilets as they were trying to smash the doors down. Total lawlessness, blood everywhere. It very quickly turned violent because, the Pistols were playing to a degree a role. And the violence was around them. It got misconstrued. Just too many, this is going to sound very classist, but too many really stupid people couldn't see beyond the superficial kind of thing.
Yeah.
And just thought, oh yeah, they didn't understand the playfulness.
They were getting totally carried away with it.
The situationist kind of side
Yeah,
of it. They
yeah.
just saw it as violence.
Yeah.
They didn't sort of see that the subtlety and the nuance was lost on them. And I'm jumping the gun, but that's why punk petered out so quickly.
One final point before we take a little break. You mentioned earlier the importance of like Hawkwind, Lemmy in this scene. Just tell me a little bit about what your feelings on that.
Well, I didn't realise it at the time, but looking back, and Lydon was a massive Hawkwind fan.
Right,
he used to sell Speed, which of course was the drug du jour for all of us. But Hawkwind were a long-haired punk band. They were a counterculture band in 1971, 1972, involved with the squatting scene, involved with all the sort of anti kind of police kind of stuff. They were a real street band. And if they'd have cut their hair, they would have been the Pistols almost.
Yeah.
And it was fascinating because, Lemmy was one of the few long-haired rockers who got a free pass during punk. Like, he was great mates with the adverts.
There's such a punk vibe off him, isn't there?
Yeah, he was part of that speakeasy scene,
Yeah.
which was the Pistols and Nick Kent, and Phil Lynott was also part of that. UFO, another band that got a bit of a free pass. And Lemmy told me about trying to teach Sid how to play guitar. And he said everybody in the whole world has some musical prowess apart from Sid. He said it was just absolutely impossible. He said he was a lovely guy, and you hear this about Sid pre-heroin and Nancy. So I'm not going to blame Nancy totally for everything. He was a sweetheart apparently, but totally useless. It's interesting because we always think of punk as spiky-haired people. But Ian Dury made the point. I interviewed Ian months before he died in Dublin. It was very poignant. He had a little portable chemotherapy unit on his chest.
Right.
Went out and played an amazing gig. And he sort of said, what the Pistols did was open the door for the freaks. Now, this was his choice of language. I would never use it myself. But he said, you wouldn't have had a spastic number one on Top of the Pops without the Sex Pistols. He said, I couldn't have been a pop star without the Pistols. But suddenly I'm there, hit me with your rhythm stick on Top of the Pops. And, he was saying it was not just, punk bands, but Nick Lowe, Reckless Eric, Lena Lovitch, Costello, Screen, even Dire Straits broke through that
You're
kind
losing
of,
me now, Stuart.
Yeah, no, I mean, Dire Straits and Squeeze played together. I saw them in Deptford. And
this is your hot take corner.
And bizarrely, Dire Straits had quite good punk credentials before it went horribly wrong.
I didn't know any of this.
Yeah. And we'll talk obviously about, the next wave of music that was directly influenced by punk. But it gave a lot of other people who were mavericks the chance to kind of find a niche for themselves.
Yeah, Glenn talks very fondly in his book about Ian Jury, actually, and Ian Jury, a great talent. Okay, we're going to take a little break, then we'll come back and get into a bit more detail on the album. So Stuart, throughout 76, I think the earthquake hasn't hit yet, but we're getting rumblings on the Richter scale. Actually, in summer 76, we have the very famous Lesser Freehold gig, which is, basically anyone who's anyone subsequently in music in Manchester goes to this gig. There's Joy Division, Buzzcocks, the Smiths, the whole lot of them. I tend to think that's like anyone who ever saw the two of us like sub-editing in Hot Press, it's like they there weren't many, but anyone who did it subsequently started a magazine, But at the end of 76, we have something you talked about earlier. This is one of the most seismic weeks in the history of not just music, but pop culture. In the same week, Anarchy in the UK and the Bill Grundy appearance. The thing about the Grundy appearance subsequently, it's like the next day, this is like all over the tabloids. This is all over the media. So do you think that is like a moment where punk, it sort of goes mainstream to some extent, or?
Well, I suppose a mainstream audience got a taste of it, and kids like me thought, right, this is definitely the direction we want to pursue for the next year or two. The reaction was a complete overreaction. And again, I don't think the circumstances exist anymore for it to happen in the same way. I think we saw for years the NME and Melody Maker and Sounds chasing punk because they maybe didn't recognise it when it happened, and creating all these stupid movements and hyping stuff up because they were frightened about missing the next big thing. But it got to a point where they were waiting for something that couldn't quite happen. We'll talk about punk's legacy and what is punk.
Yeah.
But I see something like drill music as being very punk. And I suppose in a way, it has kind of caught the imagination and got bad kind of headlines in the newspapers, all the postcodes, sort of like stabbings and stuff like that. So that maybe is the nearest thing I've seen in the UK to sort of punk. But it was everywhere. Everybody had an opinion. Everybody cared about it, either in a positive or negative fashion. It was just seismic. Within a week or two, just boom, punk was everywhere. And within 4 or 5 months, it had just completely sort of taken over. It spread like wildfire. You suddenly had this like amazing proliferation of fanzines, and fanzine culture was huge. To me, these were biblical texts like Sniffing Glue and Ripped and Torn and things like that. And Sniffing Glue would have interviewed Lydon quite a bit. And Lydon, again, we'll talk about him, the pros and cons. But he was an interesting character because on one hand, he was the king of punk. But he'd talk about in interviews Parliament and Funkadelic and Faust and reggae. I never knew about Peter Tosh and Culture and Dr. Alimantado until I would religiously check out anything because I was so enthralled to Lydon that he mentioned. And there was that breadth of music that he was into, which hinted at what was to come with Public Image. So Lydon, was an incredibly important figure because he was whip smart and deviated from what people thought was the traditional punk script quite a bit.
Yeah, his taste in music, like the breadth of it, was just incredible and remarkably influential. Specifically on the Grundy thing, I suppose it's established now, that he was basically a complete pisshead and, he was drunk during the appearance. Even still, I'm not still entirely sure what he was going for with that interview. It's like what he was trying to pull off, or what, you know, even if he was sober, like, you know what I mean?
It's hard to put yourself in Bill Grundy's head.
Yeah.
I mean, clearly he was a dirty old man.
Listen, his interactions with Susie on that show, he would have had, if he'd stayed on TV, there could have been more problems coming down the track for Bill.
There was obviously a massive drinking culture, and there used to be a couple of newsreaders who'd slur their words. There was a guy called Reginald Bosanquet, who I think actually famously went into the sex shop. I think he was into his kind of S&M. And if
I think I've heard of this guy.
If Reginald Bosanquet is still alive, we might have to cut this bit out. But if he's not, we're fine, because he can't sue. Dead man can't sue. But old Reggie, and finally in radio, doing a Reggie became parlance for slurring your words.
Yeah.
Like, I just Reggie'd that.
Yeah.
So it was quite common for TV presenters to go on network TV with 14 million viewers, like half pissed, or wholly pissed, like Grundy was.
But I mean, you know, you talk about people maybe not making the impact nowadays, but we have to hand it to, I think, Steve Jones, particularly at the end of that interview. His swearing is just all-time Hall of Fame. you dirty fucker. And you've Grundy going, what a clever boy, you know, and he's like, what a fucking rotter.
My admiration for Steve Jones down through the years, I thought his book, you know, Lonely Boy,
which I think Pistol is based on, actually.
Yeah, Pistol, hence the singular title. I mean, I've never met anybody who swears as much and uses the F word as a vowel, a verb, a proverb, or whatever. I mean, he gets so many F words into each sentence. But there's a sensitivity about the guy. And then to read his story where he talks about his appalling kind of childhood and his stepdad and everything, and the way that, like a lot of working class kids, he saw rock and roll as an escape. The career he's built for himself, you know, since. I mean, Jonesy's Jukebox, when it was on the air, was fantastic radio, very, very funny. But also, and I think it came across in Pistol, he did, through sheer determination, he couldn't play a note hardly, but he just took loads of speed, stayed up and learnt to play guitar.
Well, in the end, I mean, his guitar playing is just phenomenal on this album. It's, you know, it's just absolutely electric, brilliant, gets you up out of your seat, makes you want to jump around. And like you're saying, it's just the whole idea tied in with the Pistols as well, of this kind of working class uprising, like legitimate, like sort of working class culture. So next, I mean, at the center of this album, I think, like, there is the three kind of great singles. There is Anarchy in the UK, Pretty Vacant, God Save the Queen. One other thing I wanted to touch on Anarchy, actually, I mean, Pistols, there's two really significant TV appearances from this time. There is obviously the Grundy one, which was a scandal, but also the So It Goes, Tony Wilson, doing Anarchy in the UK. I mean, this is one of the great TV appearances by a rock band. There's no question.
It's really interesting. I was interviewing Lee Child 5 or 6 years ago. Lee Child was one of the sound men.
Oh, this is the novelist.
Granada TV.
Unbelievable. Wow,
we used to get So It Goes very late at night down in London. And I remember again seeing that. Jordan was sort of fantastic. She had her sort of T-shirt on, didn't she? Had to have like bits sort of blacked out with gaffer tape. Was it she had swastikas? I have to add, you know, people often say to me, oh, can you stand over everything from punk? And, you know, the swastika thing even then, I wasn't sure was a good look. That was maybe a bit of a misstep. But most of that stuff that McLaren and Westwood hatched for Sex and Sedition airs, really amazing, and still looks super cool now, because nothing dates more than clothes and can look really kind of stupid. But the punk stuff looks brilliant. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, the next single after this is the three singles come out before the album, but the next one in sort of spring, summer 77 is God Save the Queen. Now, I mean, it's unbelievable to think they could ratchet up the scandal any further, but like God Save the Queen in the Jubilee year, this was like insurrection again, wasn't it? I mean,
the Jubilee week, it just seemed so seditious that anybody would take a pot shot at Her Majesty. Again, you know, we think TV is biased these days, but if you look at something like the BBC, you have anti-royalist sentiment, you have pro-Tory, and you do hear opposing voices. You never, ever heard an opposing voice to the monarchy.
Right.
One of the reasons that Anarchy was so amazing was actually dared to say IRA and UDA. You know, you'd never mention the IRA and UDA outside of condemnation of them, mainly the IRA, to be honest. So this whole idea that we're even like naming things like that. But yeah, God Save the Queen. She ain't no human being. Fascist regime. I mean, this was enough to get you locked up in the tower.
Yeah.
And I think there have been sort of, declassified papers showing that they did look at charging the Pistols, explore the possibility of treason charges.
Yeah.
This was actually mooted. It's been proved. So that was how much it got up people's noses.
Yeah.
And of course, the fact it never got to number one was an absolute sort of scandal.
Yeah. What was it, like Sailing by Rod Stewart or something?
Oh, Jesus. Yeah. At least the Virgin chart had the good grace to have it at number one. And obviously Branson, the king of the hippies, became punk's saviour.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it just absolutely, it wasn't played on the radio. But let's be honest, that's part of the fun.
Yeah.
To a degree, if they hadn't been banned, you wouldn't have been quite so...
Well, you talk about the lyrics, I mean, and I totally agree. Like, the way in Anarchy, that is this the UDA, is this the IRA? I thought it was the UK, or just another country, another council tendency. I mean, Johnny Lydon's just on fire with the lyrics at this point. Similarly, God Save the Queen. There's a bit in it I always thought was, we're the future and you can't even see it. But I was looking at it recently and it's, when there's no future, how can there be sin? I mean, what a line! Like, it's just phenomenal, the stuff he was coming out with.
I'm sure there have been university theses on God Save the Queen.
Yeah.
But it's rare you go through a song and you think, that's perfect, that's perfect.
Totally.
It's word economy. Every single word is there for a reason. Every single word resonates. It's just that those four singles, and I do include Holidays in the Sun, to me are pop perfection, because it was interesting actually when McLaren did the Rock and Roll Swindle, which I've extremely mixed feelings about. But he did a couple of orchestral versions and disco versions. The Black Arabs. I did a couple of disco versions of the Pistols tunes. And they work really well in all the orchestrally. They work well. They were actually great pop songs, and it took me years of interviewing Lydon for him to admit that Pretty Vacant was based on SOS by ABBA. And I know Matlock has had the good grace to admit that for a few more years. But Lydon, no, you're talking rubbish. You're talking rubbish. And one day, about a few years ago, he said, "Oh yeah, you're fucking right." So there was a pop sensibility. People don't necessarily think the first words you associate with the Pistols. Pop is not one of them. But they were a pop band in many ways.
No, absolutely. And I talked to Glenn a bit about that, that SOS, he heard it when he was trying to write Pretty Vacant, and it was a jumping off point. He just got like some inspiration to it when he was listening in a cafe or whatever. It's like, I know how to finish this song. But in terms of the pop influence, I mean, maybe the apex is reached with Pretty Vacant. I mean, and I was saying to Glenn, he just briefly mentioned in his memoir, he talks about Kubrick and Clockwork Orange during the punk era. But to me, that song and video is just perfect. It's like the gang in Clockwork Orange just wrote a song and made a video for it. It's totally perfect.
Jonesy with a knotted handkerchief. And look, he couldn't play a note and he was problematic, but Sydney looked quite amazing.
He looks brilliant in the video.
It's funny because, Steve made the point to me and countless other times. If they'd have called him, Sid Nice, he'd have helped little old ladies across the road with their shopping. They shouldn't have called him Vicious because he had to live up to that. Sid was so desperately looking for a family. So he was denied one, a stable one, and he just wanted to be one of the gang, and he was called Vicious, so he behaved in a vicious manner. I did like the fact, a bit like, later on with the Shaman, Ebenezer Good, Ease Good. The fact it was on top of the pops, We're So Pretty, We're They, Cunt. It was great to hear the word cunt on prime time radio and television. It was amazing because the BBC used to ban everything, but for some reason, perhaps they felt guilty about the first two. They went, "Oh, we can't." But yeah, We're So Pretty, We're So Vacant. That's a great line.
Yeah, we're vacant and we don't care. I always thought that'd be a great joint manifesto for the two of us, actually. But I mean, we also have to give a nod to, the production on this album, Chris Thomas and Bill Price, the guitars just over-layered. It's just so overpowering, definitely years later, Oasis, Noel was definitely taking a lot of notes listening to this album.
Absolutely. With the greatest respect to Chris Spedding and Dave Goodman, who had them in the studio beforehand and did decent jobs of capturing something. it was only when Chris Thomas got together with Jonesy and did the Phil Spector Wall of Sound and built layer upon layer upon layer upon layer, then added more layers, that the Pistols got that really bollocky sound, that big fat sound.
Yeah, and it still sounds absolutely brilliant. It's, you know, it sounds as good as any rock album around. I mean, when I was talking to Slash like last year, I was making the point to him that a lot of like rock bands now lean into this kind of smooth, almost sanitized stadium sound, and he was like, that's getting away from totally what rock music was about. You know, that the reason he and people of his generation got into it was just kind of raucous, you know, electrifying. And I mean, it's there in Guns N' Roses as well. Like, Nevermind the Bollocks, you can hear the influence on Guns N' Roses.
Funny enough, that the two punk debut albums that I think sonically have lasted and sound brilliant, as good now as they did then, was the Pistols and the Slits.
Yeah.
Cut just sounds like it could be made yesterday. Just again, the thing with the Pistols, you can't help but going off on tangents. I interviewed Johnny Lydon shortly after Viv Albertine's memoir came out, and I said, John, what did you think of Viv talking about, you know, giving you a blowjob? He went, oh no, you didn't, Viv. Oh, tell me no. I said, have you got the book near you? So I do. Read it to me. So I had to read this thing to Lydon.
Oh, my God.
About Viv going down, describing how crusty and smelly
Jesus.
Lydon's crotch was. And he was just going, oh, no, Viv, you shouldn't have. It's the only time I've heard Lydon absolutely lost for words.
Yeah. One of the very few times. I mean, there's different aspects to this album. Like you talked about Holidays in the Sun, which is like this kind of sardonic sort of like socio-political commentary. They kind of do a drive-by on the New York Dolls on New York. It's just like a diss track. And there's this kind of like teen angst as well and stuff like 17 and No Feelings. But one very important part of the album and of punk generally is like this kind of dark nihilistic element, which is most specifically there in Bodies, which is the second track, which just plunges you into this like incredibly disturbing story. I remember like we were talking about it before, and I remember saying to you like when I was a teenager listening to it, you're just like, oh yeah, that's some cool shit. But you listen to it now, and it's just like shocking as fuck. That song, like, you know, about, you know, basically a sort of backstreet abortion. You know,
it sounded like they were just trying to shock and there was no substance to it. But then you hear the backstory about Pauline and you're going like, whoa. And I must admit, they dealt with it. Whilst Pistol, the series, was quite cartoonish and quite panto-ish, it did have some very, very
that part
dark,
of it was, wow, yeah,
poignant moments.
Yes, yeah.
And I'm really glad, actually, that it did underline the contribution of people like Jordan and Chrissie Hynde. That was really, really important, I think, that, you know, the Pistols were seen as a band, but also an entourage of people who kind of fed into it. Going back to Holidays in the Sun, possibly one of my favourite lyrics of all time, or one-liners, is cheap holidays and other people's misery.
Fantastic, yeah.
It still applies today to people jetting off to sort of, you know, all-inclusive holidays in Haiti with sort of massive big sort of fences keeping the locals out, or indeed, you know, Lydon's beloved Jamaica. You know, you don't really go to Jamaica. You go to the holiday camp and they keep the locals out. And that's a line. I think, as I say, stuff dates so very quickly. If you've got lines and sentiments and sounds that 40 or 50, oh Jesus, coming up for 60 years later, you know, sound really fresh and relevant, that is a hell of a trick to pull off.
Well, that sort of nihilism that's there in the album, like, I just, you know, I see that aesthetic everywhere. Like, I mean, we're both big Manics guys, for example, and, you know, when they did the Holy Bible live about 10 years ago, they made a film of it. I think it's called, like, Be Kind, Be Pure, Behave, something like that, you know, based on one of the lines from the songs. But Nicky said the aesthetic of it was Sex Pistols filmed by Gaspar Noé. So it's like these shaky camera moves from the audience and really dark, sort of intense, you know, disturbing. I mean, Nine Inch Nails traffic in that, you know, in their live shows as well. And, you know, you think about authors like Bret Easton Ellis, Irvin Welsh, Chuck Palahniuk, that's all real punk, the sort of nihilism of it. Damien Hirst in art as well. Which leads us on, I suppose, to the artwork. You know, Jamie Reid, who passed away earlier this year. I mean, the artwork for the Pistols, the album, the singles, it's phenomenal, isn't it? You know,
the Jamie Reid artwork, again, you had to have all the component parts. Do you know, this is another very interesting thing that's been airbrushed from history. Lydon denies it, and I'm wondering, was I tripping? But I wasn't. When the Pistols reformed the first time, they had a press conference in the 100 Club in London. I would swear on the wall, now whether it's behind their heads or to one side, they had the Jamie Reid God Save the Queen artwork had been updated to Princess Diana with Through the Eyes Queen of Tarts.
Really?
But this seems to, I can't see any, I've searched long and hard. I've asked Lydon. I was there.
Yeah.
It was at 10:30, 11 o'clock. I'm not in the business of starting drinking till at least half past 12 of an afternoon. But no, it was definitely there. I made notes of it and referencing the piece I wrote, Queen of Tarts.
Wow.
Maybe they felt with what subsequently happened to Diana, it was too raw. But I mean, Jamie Reid, and it's only recently, I suppose since he died, that I've been online and seen some of the other work he did. It wasn't just, he was a phenomenal, but again, right man for the times.
Yeah, it's incredible. And also with the artwork, I mean, we also have to talk about the look. I mean, we've touched on it. Like when you have that, you look at the interview they did with Grundy and the Bromley contingent are there, you know, in some ways, like I feel youth culture hasn't got beyond this. It's just like the look of them all. It's just like some dystopian sci-fi movie that could be released now. You know what I mean?
We mentioned one of many controversies with Bill Grundy.
Yeah.
But I remember being in the Virgin flagship in Marble Arch the day before the Obscene Crime Squad, or whatever they're called back then, descended because they took umbrage with the word bollocks being in extremely large letters, and it went to court and they proved that bollocks was ancient English for something, a colloquialism. It wasn't a profanity. So whatever the Pistols did, you know, the boat trip down the Thames, all that kind of malarkey, it was always seen as being controversial. But the title as well, I just think, you know, just the planets aligned, everything about it was perfect. And, you know, I did say to Lydon, and I was incredibly annoyed with Lydon because I was young and obviously just fixated by the Pistols. Like with Weller knocking the jam on the head, I was so cross with him. I thought, you've betrayed me. And unfortunately, there was kind of two routes to go. There was like Public Image or Motorhead. Now, Motorhead were grand, but Motorhead then led me on to a new wave of British heavy metal odyssey and sort of bands like Dumpy's Rusty Nuts. But
they're not a real band, are
they? They were a real band. And I used to go and see them and bands like Thor and all kinds of stuff.
Right.
But Lydon obviously was the one really in the band with the absolute brains, who knew when the game was up and was punk rock enough to move on. And I can look back now, and of course I now appreciate Public Image as being the equal of the Pistols. They didn't have the same shock value, but in terms of influence, I think you could argue that Peel had been as influential as the Pistols.
I think so.
So Lydon did it not once, but twice, and the second time he did it totally on his fucking own.
Yeah.
So for me, look, butter commercials, Trump, the butter commercials paid for pill records. I've no problem with that. Trump, makes me feel queasy, but I think Lydon's just being Lydon to a degree and just trying to wind people up. So maybe the current John Lydon is not a man to admire as much, but what he did in going for the Pistols to Public Image was magnificent.
Yeah. Just to emphasize again on the look, I mean, it's, you know, Susie Jordan and the genius of Vivienne Westwood, you know, I mean, it's there and, you know, continues to be a huge influence on culture. I mean, the Pistols in Ireland, like the link with Ireland, I mean, we could do I think a 10-part narrative series on Johnny Lydon's adventures in Ireland over the years. Gets arrested when he's here in 1980, spends a few days in the Joy. I mean,
yeah, it was. I mean, chaos just followed him about.
It did at the time. Yeah.
He came across to the Hot Press Awards because things had got, you know, he'd been attacked by Teddy Boys and razed, and he was going to die if he had stayed in the UK. Came over to the Hot Press Awards, and as part of the payment, he wanted a massive amount of dope for the 2 or 3 days. And his uncle Jimmy, I think, came to the Hot Press Awards. I think they were down in Cork, and I didn't realise, because he didn't talk about it. It wasn't like sort of Shane O'Hooligan. Mm-hmm. He didn't wear his Irishness on his sleeve or his record sleeve, but so going back now, looking at it, you can see the whole Catholic influence. And I had to break the news to Johnny Lydon that Big Tom had died. Mm. Now, Big Tom and the Mainliners are famously what they call country and Irish, which is like a pig farmer from the Midlands of Ireland, pretending to be.
I met when I was a kid. Got a photo taken next
pretending to be Hank Williams. Mm-hmm. Now, whether this is urban myth or true, but Big Tom and the Mainliners played in New York, and the name like the Mainliners, the Andy Warhol set turned up, expecting some sort of counterculture band from Ireland, and saw this mountain of a guy who spent his days on a tractor and by night was Big Tom with his Stetson.
Yeah.
And I told Johnny that Big Tom had died about 10 years ago, and he started crying. And I said, "Are you okay, John?" He said, "I'm really sorry." He said, "One of my most precious memories was on a Sunday afternoon. The folks weren't really into their music, but they'd get a bottle of sherry out, get a bit piddled, dance around the living room, then go upstairs and we'd be sent out." So he remembered like his parents getting it on, and foreplay was Big Tom and the Mainliners.
Yeah.
But he's actually, very proud of his, like he's English. He sees himself as English, but he's incredibly proud of his Irish roots. There's very strong opinions.
Yeah.
I spoke to him about the IRA and I said, look, do you see some sort of a justification protecting their community? Absolutely not. He's got zero tolerance, rightly or wrongly, towards that. But yeah, obviously Ireland's extremely important to him.
Yeah.
Even though he got banged up in the Joy, I think he took great umbrage.
It's incredible detail to that anecdote as well, is that, he spent a few nights there apparently, and it coincided with a film showing. They have film showings in the prison.
Yeah.
So he said, fuck, I may as well go along. I've nothing else to do. So he went, and it was a punk documentary.
Brilliant.
Which was fantastic. But I mean, there's other stuff like, I think, was it Jones and Cook were in this band called the Greedy Bastards? Have you heard of these guys?
Oh, the Greedy Bastards, the Greedies.
Were they like a Tin Lizzy Pistol?
Yeah, that would have been hatched in the Speakeasy.
Yeah. I think they did an impromptu gig at some hot press party in McGonagall's one year.
I think they did. I mean, Jonesy obviously went on to become a hair metaler for a while, which was very ill-advised.
Yeah.
He also famously was on the very last Roy Orbison recordings.
Oh, was he? Yeah.
And he says that he did a session, so he became a real kind of gun for hire in LA, and he went and recorded tracks with Orbison. Roy apparently gave him a cassette. I hope I'm telling this story right. Mm-hmm. Orbison dies. There's no record of these songs, and Jonesy, I think, lost the cassettes. So I think there are
perfect punk moments.
So somewhere out there are three, tracks with Jonesy and Roy Orbison. So an incredible sort of career. And the fact he went to LA and became a radio show host is quite remarkable.
So as we're getting to the end, I mean, like the reunion tours. I mean, I saw them at Electric Picnic. I guess it was 07, 08. I mean, I guess I was happy to have seen the Sex Pistols, but it's that thing of, I don't know, the reunion tours where everyone was a bit like, nah, weren't they? Like, I don't think anyone was like, I was blown away by the Pistols reunion tours.
I have fallen foul, and I understand this because it's their own scene, but I've fallen foul of a lot of modern day punk artists. And I get on with really, really well, in that I see punk as a particular set of circumstances, a particular time. Like the SAS, get in there, do the damage, and before they know it, you've gone.
Yeah.
So I just do not... It doesn't really bother me that people call themselves punk. But do I think Green Day are punk? No. I mean, why would you religiously copy the Clash 20 or 30 years later? Why? The whole idea about the Pistols was to be yourself. Now, you could argue about how much was McLaren, all this kind of stuff, but it was to do something different. It wasn't supposed to be a uniform. And, of course, punk became a uniform. Lydon sussed that. Time to move on. But... I just, and yes, I've been to see a few punk bands. I always have this thing. If a punk band continued on and developed, like the Ruts DC, Buzzcocks, then that's grand because that's a band evolving. But if a band, and Stiff Little Fingers, kept going, but I don't really want to see bands reforming after 20 or 30 years. And, you know, they have every right to make a living. I'm not particularly sure. You know, funnily enough, I was just thinking the other day, if Generation Sex with Billy Idol came to Dublin, would I go or wouldn't I? Probably would go. But I just feel a bit queasy about, you know, we used to look at the Teddy Boys slavishly wearing drapes and banging on about Elvis. And you go, that was 10 years ago. That's your mums and dad's music. I don't want punk to become what it was opposed to. Don't want it to be establishment. Don't want it to be cozy. Don't want it to be nice and sanitized. I wanted it to be the way it was and remember it that way. So for me, I look at the likes of Green Day playing Enormodones and shooting toilet rolls out into the crowd. That's like, oh no, lads.
Well, it's funny. I was saying to Thurston Moore, like, there's this kind of sweet spot, I think, with certain bands like the Pistols and Nirvana, where it has this kind of punk pop sensibility, but there's real artistry to it, and there is a genuine sort of anti-authority edge to it, you know. So there's certain bands who are able to achieve that. I mean, it's funny with the reunions. Like, there's certain videos you can see of the Filthy Lucre tour, you know, of them doing particular songs and the way it's all cut and it's made to look great. And you think, God, maybe this could have been something. I don't know. Like, maybe if they'd done a kind of production like we were saying the Manics did with the Holy Bible, and it was just like this really, you know, kind of smaller, more intense thing. But then they called it the reunion Filthy Lucre, didn't they? So
they were honest. They were honest. Look, I'm glad they got a payday.
Yeah.
As I say, I was really upset when the Sex Pistols broke up. And I remember one of the Inkies saying, oh, the Sham Pistols. There was talk of Jimmy Percy joining up with the Pistols. And I thought at the time, brilliant. Now I'm going, thank God. Can you imagine how awful the Sham Pistols would have been? I mean, it's in the name. It would have been terrible. Look, obviously Lydon had song ideas that went lock, stock and barrel into Public Image that didn't really sit with the Pistols. You do wonder what it would have been like if it had been album number 2. The only indicator we have possibly of album number 2 was Belson Was a Gas. And I'm sorry.
Yeah,
that sort of crossed that line.
That was in our tasteless power rankings. We have Moore's Murder at number 2. This, you know, at number 1 probably.
It wasn't arch. It wasn't. It wasn't playful. It was just deeply offensive, I thought. And as a tune, it was just poo. So, you know, I'm delighted they broke up when they did. They've left us this absolutely immaculate 11 out of 10 album. Even on that tour, and I saw them at the Picnic, okay, you could kind of go, is this the right thing to do? The songs still sounded absolutely immense. And of course, Johnny, you know, dropped his keks. There's some lovely photographs of John Lydon's bum hole doing the rounds.
I remember that. Now this is all coming back. I blocked it all out.
Absolutely. I tell you, once seen, never forgotten.
Yeah.
And there were people actually looking quite perturbed by them for whatever reasons.
Yeah.
But look, you know, it was a moment in time for me that is worth cherishing and you know, sort of remembering. But I prefer to see punk. I see it. Americans will obviously argue that punk was Iggy Pop and New York Dolls, or they'd argue it was Derby Crash and it was
This
Henry
is all
Rollins.
played out in the, you know, when they launched the punk series and Johnny got into this very strange. You should hear, if anyone hasn't seen it, to hear Henry Rollins talking about this. Henry Rollins just hadn't a clue what was going on with this. You know, he said Lydon was pissed out of his head and just started going off on one on Marky Ramone.
but you know what? This goes back to what I said earlier. Music, good music, should be tribalistic.
I think so.
You should claim ownership. You should disparage people who disagree with you strongly, vehemently. Not violently, but you should have some really good pub arguments. So, you know, there's still all these years later a mystique about the Pistols. Like the Beatles, there's still an industry. I mean, I don't know how many books you're going to have about them. But funnily enough, there's still other little bits and pieces that emerge you haven't heard before. And as I say, I totally recommend Jordan's book for doing that.
I mean, Johnny's, you know, when we talk about the Irishness, like, and I was saying to Thurston as well, that's sort of like anti-establishment, anti-authority aspect to him, the flair for language, the humour. I think that's all quite Irish, you know, the way he expressed it. And I think, I mean, the influence with the Pistols and with Pill, the early Pill stuff I think it's almost Bowie-esque, really, in terms of the impact it's had on culture, you know what I mean?
Well, in an Irish context, Shane O'Hooligan formed the Nipple Erectors, then called them the Nips. But, I remember meeting Shane, reminding him of his Union Jack blazer and him getting very annoyed. But he used to walk around in a Union Jack blazer. But clearly Shane MacGowan and the Pogues were taking notes. We just touched on the fact that, Joy Division were all at the Manchester Free Trade Hall. But that next wave, bands you don't necessarily think were of punk, but, Frankie Goes to Hollywood.
Yeah.
I was talking to Ian Broody recently. Whilst all that was going on in Manchester and going on in London, it was going on in Eric's. And, you look at the band that Broody was in, big in Japan, Bill Drummond, the KLF took notes from McLaren and the Pistols, the Bunnymen, Steve Strange after the Moors Murderers started, Visage, Boy George was Culture Club, Bananarama, Ultravox.
Yeah.
It goes on in wave after wave after wave. They probably would have started bands, but the catalyst perhaps really for them doing it was the Pistols and the Clash.
We touched on it briefly earlier, just, these lads couldn't make a cup of tea without having an argument over it. So, this idea that's still going on, 50 years later, and there was, of course, the row over the TV series. Everyone's always saying, I did this, I did that. And McLaren's role in it, he definitely quarterbacked it to some degree, and the conceptual ideas, when I was looking at that So It Goes appearance recently, something I never noticed before is Glenn has this Karl Marx shirt on him, and Johnny incorporating these ideas about anarchy and stuff into his lyrics. I think that sort of strain of the sort of intellectual political aspect, there was a big part of Malcolm McLaren in there, I think.
I think, whilst not overstating it, you can't understate it either. McLaren was in New York. A few of his ideas, which fell on deaf ears, were disastrous for New York Dolls, but the whole communist shtick he brought back with him to London. He was a very smart guy. He was a wheeler dealer. He was a grifter, a very complex man who went on and made some great records. Again, you could say he was quite parasitical in the way he went over to New York and leached on that whole kind of scene, but he was able to fashion it into something that he could sell back to the UK. I think McLaren was a deeply flawed individual, but I tell you what, a wonderful man to spend 2 hours with.
Okay, to wrap up, we've got a few categories. Strangest lyric. Now, the rhyming of Antichrist and anarchist. This is probably wins this category, I think.
That was stretching it somewhat. Yeah.
But it still sounds brilliant. So I think it works. The other contender is maybe on Bodies, when he says fuck 5 times in about 10 seconds.
And he really sounds angry. There's something quite depraved and quite sort of insane about it, which really does sort of suit the subject matter. EMI was just a great 2 fingers.
Yeah, wasn't it?
I think I was editing the A&M bit at the end. It was dangerous, but I remember Jonesy saying, look, it was dangerous and it was a bit mad, but it was a load of fun as well.
Digsy's Dinner, they should have left it off the album award. This is kind of one of those albums. There's certain albums in rock history that are just kind of perfect. it comes in under 40 minutes. So, you could say maybe, 17 or one of those tracks.
Oh, no, you couldn't. No, I'm a lazy sod.
Well, yeah, one thought I did have was, because it was so short in that kind of punk way, was there something from the Pistols archive that you could add to it? And I was thinking, Sid's version of My Way is Stuart is, Look, do you know an interesting story about that is when Kubrick was doing Full Metal Jacket, he was going to use that over the end credits, but in the end he went for Painted Black, sort of definitely more musically sophisticated. But,
I think it's quite interesting because I have a lot of time for Jones and Cook and Matlock, but what they did next, the rich kids were muck. The professionals were really awful. I'm sorry, lads. It was only Lydon. It was all 4 of them, of course, but I do think Lydon was a genius.
Final 2. If this album was a footballer, I was thinking this would be some kind of weird Frankenstein's monster of like Leo Messi and like 80s Crazy Gang Wimbledon or something. Maybe like a hard man with a bit of finesse, like a sort of Roy Keane or Graham Souness or something.
There's definitely a bit of George Best in there, isn't there? I'm trying to think now, a bit of Stan Bowles. I mean, all those kind of maverick, you know.
But married with a kind of hatchet man, sort of like take no prisoners.
Bit of Chopper Harris. Yeah, bit of Chopper Harris down at Chelsea.
Finally, which track wins the album? I think it might be God Save the Queen. Perfectly encapsulates. Or do you? What's your take?
No, I mean, I adore God Save the Queen. Just something about Holidays in the Sun, the Jack Boot intro. You know, the drama of it. Maybe it just snuck up on me a little bit more than the others that were sort of played to death. But when I listen to the album, that really stands out.
Let's give the Holidays in the Sun as a fantastic, maybe somewhat overlooked track. Stuart, thank you. That's it for the first episode of Hot Press Classics. Shortly, I'll be talking to Glen Matlock from the Sex Pistols, bassist and songwriter, and also Thurston Moore of Sonic Youth. With the two lads, I go into quite a bit of detail about the Pistols and Nevermind The Bollocks. They both have great books out, actually, as well. Glen's memoir is called Triggers, and Thurston's is called Sonic Life, so check those out. But now we're going to talk to them about Nevermind The Bollocks. Actually talked to you a few times before over the phone, so it's good to finally see you in person. Yeah. You know, it's funny, actually, this afternoon I'm interviewing Glen Matlock from Sex Pistols, because he has a book coming out as well, which is very good, you know. But it's funny, like, I always think of John Lydon's sensibility, you know, that sort of anti-establishment edge and the flair he had with language and stuff was very Irish, you know, because he's second generation Irish, so I think that was an influence on punk as well. Well, I mean, like he's such an. I actually think he's like almost like Bowie-esque in his influence, you know, between Sex Pistols and Pill, you know.
Well, he's so argumentative. I mean, I think that has to do with his own sort of biological makeup. He shuts people down in conversation, so it's just like, it's not much of a conversation, is it? I mean, he's constantly using the tagline like, well, I'm working class, mate. Defining himself at all costs. Yeah. And it's just like, I come from a culture where there's no specific real class system. It's a little more malleable about like how you kind of exist in society with your own economic kind of reality. But you very rarely, growing up in the USA, does any young person say like, I'm working class, I'm middle class, I'm upper class, and there's no. I mean, it's recognized, but it's never it's never defined in any really hard term in a way. It's just like, oh, your parents got money, or you know, or my parents don't, or it's just like, it's more about just sort of like the idea of sort of the comfort of your life as opposed to the discomfort of your life. So hearing somebody like Lydon sort of constantly defining himself in a certain economic source kind of conceit is just like, it's funny, but I also kind of like, you know, he's so argumentative to the point where I find it comical. And I think he uses it because he's very into theater and even when he sort of will go on a rage of sort of like talking about, you know, identity politics. At the end of it, he'll make a funny face or something. You know, like it's all a bunch of absurd bullshit anyway, isn't it? It's like let's go get a pint and have a smoke, you know, like So, and I kind of like that too. It's just sort of like, it's like we're all just bozos on the bus to begin with, so it's just like, you know.
Yeah, no, there's a total absurdity to it, you know. I just think specifically with Sex Pistols and Pill, it's just like fucking unbelievable what he did at that time, you know. But you know, I mean, growing up in Ireland in the 90s, I actually got into Sonic Youth because my two favorite bands, Nirvana and Blur, were always talking about Sonic Youth. And I actually bought Goo, and I remember like listening to it when I was like 15, 16 and going like, what the fuck is this? I don't get this at all. But like that was still like that was the last era where if you bought something in a record store you had to fucking commit to it, you know. So I kept playing it, and eventually I had a breakthrough, and I was like, this is fucking genius, and I just became like a Sonic Youth obsessive, you know. But I mean, the whole Nirvana link, it's interesting as well. In the book you talk about how it was particularly magical just in the build up to Nevermind, and the way it seemed to be the culmination of like a sort of decade of underground culture, you know.
Yeah. I mean, I remember hearing a cassette of it, and I think I sort of mentioned the book where I was sort of like, I wasn't immediately thrilled by it because it was kind of straight ahead, and but realizing at the same time like, oh, this will probably connect with a lot of people, especially those who really kind of go towards the more Pixies kind of vibe of pop punk or whatever. But nobody thought like it was going to turn the world on its head. But you know, who thought like Nevermind The Bollocks was going to turn the world on its head either? And it's kind of what, you know, if you talk to Matlock, I mean, it's like, did he know? I would be curious, like, did he know that recording, even though he's kind of ousted on that recording, and by the time they sort of do those sessions, those are his songs. A lot of those, I mean, a lot of the basic tenets of all those songs, it's Glen, who, without Glen, there's no record. You know? Even though Glen is like kind of like excised, there's no record. And so that is like, that dysfunction in that group is kind of remarkable because it's really reflective of like typical familial dysfunction where, you know, people are kind of like ostracized in families and stuff like that. And that's what's going on. It's just like, here's this person who actually kind of creates a lot of the language of this group, and then all of a sudden it's just like it's somewhat taken away from them, but it becomes like this incredible document. And his story is so interesting. I kind of really want to read Trigger's his book. I thought his Pistols book is kind of the best one because, I mean, Jones's book is all about just like trying to get laid all the time, but he has a story in there, and then Lydon is just kind of like me, where at least Glen's is kind of, you kind of get more, it's more interesting and you get a more historical kind of certitude in it, like people he communicates with, even if it's by happenstance, you know, like the guy from Slick, S-L-I-K, I forget that, you know, like thinking about playing music together and then playing in that old abandoned BBC building on the Thames in Hammersmith, which is would become the Riverside Studios, which is really interesting to me because when I moved to London, I realized I was in North London and I lived like very close to where Wessex Studios was, like literally 2 blocks away, and I would like go on my bicycle and go over there and look at it. Right. And it's where Bollocks was ultimately turned into the beautiful masterpiece that it is. And now that studio is a bespoke, a loft apartments, you know, and you know, you have millions of pounds to live there, and it's a different world. And then I kind of relocated to South London recently, and I live very close to where really close to the brewery that Paul Cook was like doing an internship at to become an electrician. You know, and the only reason I know this is because Matlock talks about this in his book. He actually really details these little things about where they first play before Lydon comes in, you know, and where Julian Temple first hears them, you know, because I interviewed Julian Temple once and he talked about like, I said, like, when did you first meet these guys? Did you go to McLaren's store? He's like, no, I was living in Hammersmith, walking along the river, and I heard some sounds coming out of this building, and I went in, and there was these three blokes just like caterwauling away.
Yeah.
And I said, "Oh, can I take some photos?" And they were like, "We don't care." And then they kind of became mates because he kept going over there.
Yeah.
And I always thought that was really mysterious. It's like, what do you mean you were walking along a river and there was like an abandoned building? That scenario always kind of mystified me.
Yeah.
And then I found myself all of a sudden walking along the Thames. And then reading Matlock's book, where he says like there was this building, and it was an abandoned BBC building that would soon become Riverside Studios, but that's where that was.
Yeah.
And being there physically, I was like, oh. And so since I've been living in England for the last 12 years, I've been sort of like living in this kind of really interesting places that were very sort of Pistols lore kind of neighborhoods. That wasn't my idea, but I'm glad it was because it means so much to me.
Yeah.
And as it were, when I first came over, it was in the context of playing with Glenn Branca's group. And the first time we played in England was at the Riverside Studios.
Wow. Yeah.
And that's in '83. And I had absolutely no idea where I was.
Yeah.
But that's where I was. We were playing in the place where the Pistols actually sort of began.
Yeah.
And I never would have known that. Reading Lydon's book, reading Jonesy's book, Cook has yet to do his.
Yeah.
Sid never got around to doing it. But reading Matlock's book really sort of is great as a really good timeline. There's another Pistols book, I forget what it's called, that really goes day by day by day, and it details like where everybody is at any given time.
Yeah.
It's a private press book, but it's super researched.
Wow.
It's so good.
Yeah.
And, anyway.
Well, it's just amazing because I see their influence still all the time, everywhere. Brilliant to talk to you, Thurston. And
cool.
Listen. Thank you. Take care. Hopefully, talk to you again at some stage, Thurston.
Yeah. Cheers, man.
Cheers. See you. Bye. Bye.
Say hi to Matlock for me.
I will. Absolutely. Yeah.
I am an anti-coaster. I am an anarcho-coaster. Don't know what I want, but I know how to get it. I want to destroy passerby, 'cause I want to be anarchy. Now, dogs, buddy.
Hello.
Hiya, good to talk to you, Glenn. I was actually talking to Thurston Moore, who's a guitarist with Sonic Youth, the American band, this morning, and he has a book out. But he was saying he'd actually read a previous book you'd done. You had a different book out before, didn't you?
I did one about 25 years ago called I Was a Teenage Sex Pistol, which was well received, and it's been out and it's still available. But what I think, but this book's a bit different. It's based hanging around lyrics I've written, lyrics from songs that have affected me, and the story behind them. And one thing sort of feeds into another, but I think I've got a different viewpoint now, possibly since when I first wrote Teenage Sex Pistol a long time ago now.
Yeah. How do you think your perspective has changed in that time?
A bit more laissez-faire about it. I actually enjoyed doing the original book because, there was a lot of bad blood and things were said, and it was kind of quite a cathartic experience to do that. I've had 25 years of benefiting from that cathartic experience, and now I've got a different viewpoint, and I've done loads of things since then. Tomorrow morning I'm off flying to the States yet again to do some shows with Blondie. I've sort of said, I've been busy doing my latest album all this year, as well as touring with Blondie. You think nothing's happening, then the phone rings, and then you're off somewhere. So I'm in quite a privileged position and it puts everything in perspective somehow.
Yeah. Well, I've thoroughly enjoyed reading the book. I'm a bit of a Sex Pistols obsessive, so it was. Yeah. It's like
I'm not trying to denigrate the Sex Pistols, but hopefully this book. The other book was pretty much purely Sex Pistols. I think this.
Yeah.
is a bit different from that. Hopefully,
Yeah, no, it is. It is. You know, it's funny. You mentioned briefly in the book Kubrick Clockwork Orange and how it sort of influenced like the punk look and stuff at the time. It's like Pretty Vacant is almost like the gang from Clockwork Orange wrote a pop song. It's just kind of perfect in that way.
If you think that's kind of cool. I know some bands. One of the pre-punk bands was a band called the Heavy Metal Kids with Gary Alton.
Yeah.
Hobson, who ended up is Wayne and was it Boys from the Black Stuff or whatever it's called?
Oh, no, yeah.
It's Ain't Pet.
Yeah.
And his band, they were kind of a very Clockwork Orange kind of thing.
Yeah.
I don't know. I sort of came. I'd read the lyrics. I heard the song Blank Generation by Richard Allen Voidoid.
Yeah.
And I kind of thought I understood it. It turns out I got the wrong end of the stick. He was saying that we're an open book.
Yeah.
But I thought with what was going on in London at the time, I don't really want to raise this too much with your pedigree, but, it's the IRA and the 3-day weekend strikes and the hung parliament and rubbish polo on the streets, and it just seemed like we were going nowhere fast.
Yeah.
And to me, Pretty Vacant is like, it's like a Primal Scream kind of song, not the band, but
yeah.
But you don't know what we want, but we're going to do it anyway. And that's basically what Pistols were about. We kind of knew what we didn't want to sound like. We wanted to move on from all that. But we didn't really know what we wanted to be like. We just was going to do it anyway, and it came out how it came out. Yeah.
It's you mentioned in the book as well that Malcolm's address book, when you were going through it, it was like it had the IRA and Yoko Ono.
Yeah.
It was.
I think it might have even had hot press in it.
The most notorious of it all. Did it really? Or are you joking?
No, it had all those things. Like IT, International Times, and
oh wow.
What's that thing that Caroline Coon used to write for? Oz.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it was an address book and a half, really,
that idea, though, of the blank generation and sort of reflecting socially, politically what was going on in the UK at the time, I think like that is amazingly powerful on that album. And there's a kind of nihilism to it, which is like just incredible, really. Like, say, very powerful. I mean, do you think that aspect of the album and the Sex Pistols is why it's still so like the influence is still just everywhere?
Well, I think it strikes. I mean, it's just with that whole thing. Lots of things came together at the right time. The music and the stance and the trousers and the artwork, and people were looking for something. It's daft to always say this, but sometimes you want to get a new pair of trousers, and you go and have a look, and you don't know which ones you want till you see them. And I think there was time for a change, and people wanted something new, but I didn't really know what it was until we came along, and everybody went, "Oh, that'll do,"
Yeah.
It's just the right place at the right time. And the interesting thing with punk is that very similar things happen both sides of the Atlantic at pretty much the same time.
I mean, like, was John sort of like the final part of the jigsaw in that respect, in terms of like articulating what was happening around, in the city and in the country at the time?
No, he was the final piece in the jigsaw. There was a spirit in the band, which was mainly, to me, led by Steve Jones, who's a rogue. He's like a character out of a Jean Genet book, with a twinkle in his eye. I think he was the spirit of Sex Pistols. I think it's summed up in the God Save the Queen video where he wears the Gumby hat, the knotted anarchy handkerchief on his head. I mean, what self-respecting lead guitarist would do that? But Steve does it and pulls it off. But when John came along, he kind of encapsulated that spirit, and he had an axe to grind, and he had a chip on his shoulder, and he had this sort of second generation Irish thing coming on, and he wrote that book years later, No Blacks, No Dogs, No Irish, which must have all have affected it. It gave a whole frisson to his lyrics, really. Looking back, how much he meant it at the time was another matter, but there you go.
Yeah, it's funny, like the different elements you pick up on as well. Because I was looking at the famous clip that Tony Wilson introduced. Which is one of the most amazing live performances ever, really, by a band or a music artist. And I never noticed it before, but you had like a Karl Marx image on your shirt, which was really cool.
Yeah.
Was that your idea, or was that?
No, it was one of the shirts that Malcolm and Vivian came up with, the Anarchy shirt. It's probably the very first one. But I wore it because I liked it. You're kind of going, and some of that symbolism, it was symbolism, wasn't necessarily, I'm a Marxist or all that.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
It's just a fair cat amongst the pigeons,
Yeah.
I mean, some swastika armbands, I didn't. I thought that was too close to the Second World War still to do that, so I wouldn't wear that.
Yeah. You talk quite a bit in the book as well about going to art school and that experience. I mean, it seemed to be like open your mind quite a bit, like musically and creatively. So, do you think that was like an important springboard for you as a musician, and what you went on to?
Yeah, I do, but I didn't. I think I was only there a year, although I did into the degree in fine art painting at St Martin's, which is a pretty big deal, really, these days. And even back then it was. I didn't realise that. But in the summer holidays, I decided to take the Sex Pistols seriously. So my art project was probably the early Sex Pistols. But on top of it being somewhere to kind of float ideas around and find a bit of breathing space and not go and work in a biscuit factory or attempt to be, an electrical engineer or a draftsman or a shoe salesman. It was a bit goofing off, but there was a scene. There was a scene with all the different little art colleges in London, which are now amalgamated. There was a thing at the Royal College of Art on a Friday night, but there was a disco, and there was a guy called Edwin Pouncey who ran it. Then he became the Savage Pencil in the NME, and I got chatting to him. I think through that, really, he ended up doing that Night of Treason. Some of the Clash and the Slits played that. All these things were kind of intermingling somehow with what John was doing. They've asked school. Stephen Paul weren't. He thought it was Ponzi. And the other thing in my college was that it was right in the middle of Soho when I was 17 years old, so that, I'll probably say this in the book, you go out stuck for an idea and you walk down Old Compton Street to go to the arts supply shop to go and buy a pencil, and you'd see Lucy and Freud and Francis Bacon come falling out of the colony rooms, all-day drinking club having a good drink. It was all these things going on.
Yeah.
It was like, I'm in Soho.
But I mean, like, are you surprised about like just like the fucking phenomenal influence that one album had? And I mean, it's everywhere still. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I don't know. I've never really thought it through that much. I don't think back then any of us, me particularly, really thought past the end of the week. We lived in the moment, and it's just gone on and on. And it's great in a wild way, and everywhere you go in the world, I wasn't even in the Pistols all the way through, although I did rejoin when we reformed in subsequent years. But everywhere in the world, punk is synonymous with music that's a little bit more left field and a little bit more thinking, maybe. Might not be the most tuneful, but that's what everybody thinks. So that's kind of cool. The drag it, you do try and do different things. And it's always there as an old-fashioned kind of yardstick that people want to measure you against. That's a bit of a doubt. I mean, I'm 67 now, and it's never changed. So what can you do? You just roll with it, and you do your best. And I've got a pretty good album out now. I've had nothing but good reviews. But it's not Nevermind The Bollocks. No, it's not supposed to be Nevermind The Bollocks.
Has the different artists you've worked with over the years, like, has it been easier than the Sex Pistols? I mean, was that a particularly difficult band to be in, or
Everybody back then was kind of trying to. Not only were they vying for their place in the band, they were vying for their place in life as a young man. Maybe a bit unsure about yourself. You're kind of working out how you can push things in relationships. Maybe not thinking it through, but subconsciously, you don't know what your boundaries are and what somebody else's boundaries are. And that's where the free song came, especially between me and John. But out of that came some good songwriting and some good music. Other things I don't like the Blondie thing. I'm just playing their songs and putting my little twist to it. I mean, one of the biggest things I've ever done, I played in a version of the Faces, which is my all-time favourite. It's a shame Rod Stewart didn't do it, but Mick Hucknall sang, but it was Ronnie Wood, Kenny Jones, and McGregor. I've been mates with both of these. And they're fantastic players, and it's just like turned up and played,
Are you touring your album as well, or
because I've done the Blondie thing? It's kind of good to do, I'm kind of globe-trotting with them. I mean, this year we've been gigging in America, and we did 2 nights at Coachella Festival, and one of the nights Noel Rodgers got up with us. In fact, we even came to Ireland. We played in that castle just north of Dublin. Is it Swords? What's the castle?
Malahide.
That's cool. Hey, I'll tell you a funny thing. Sting was the headline. It was like a double-header kind of thing. Sting. We were sitting around beforehand. I know Sting a little bit with John Giddings, the promoter. So it's me, Sting, and John Giddings. And we're sitting around having a cup of coffee backstage before everything gets going. John says, Clem, he said, look, you've got this gig coming up with Steve and Paul and you. He said, all you need now is a singer. And Sting goes, I'll do it. And we go on then. He goes, Anarchy in the UK. I go, no, Sting, do it in a Geordie accent. He went, all right. Anarchy in the UK. Way up, Mum.
Fantastic. Couple of final things. I mean, Jamie Reid died recently.
Yes, sad that.
I mean, the artwork in Sex Pistols as well is fucking unreal. So what was his contribution? It was huge, obviously, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was that. He was made for Malcolm. It was quite a left field kind of character. We'd sit around talking, I think he probably floated the idea to John about anarchy as a kind of topic. It's not something that's in a 17, 18-year-old kid's immediate foremost thoughts in their mind. So I think, you didn't tell John to write a song like that, but we'd sit around talking. So and he'd been sort of involved with this sort of agitprop kind of thing with Malcolm before he got involved with us.
The song Bodies, that song? It's... I mean, when I was listening to that, when I was 17, 18, I just thought it was a cool song. But even now, I'm older, I listen to it going, it's really shocking as fuck.
Well, it is. I got a comment on that song so much, because that was one of the few songs that was written after I left the band. From what I do know about it, it's about bullshit.
It's a fucking brilliant song. The story is actually outlined in the TV series, finally. I mean, were you not mad about the Danny Boyle series, or what was your...
No, I was disappointed, actually, because before it was made, I went and had some meetings with Danny Boyle and put my side of the case, and he said, oh, yeah, we'll do this and that. And when it came out, he hadn't done. And I wouldn't have signed off on it. Therefore, I don't know it was going to be like that. So, from what I know about my portrayal of what was going on, isn't very truthful. That whole thing with Paulie, and it's kind of quite well shot. And, I've seen it on the private screen. If the truthfulness about my thing, especially my leading the band, of being sacked, which I wasn't, I left, and that's what I'm annoyed about. Whether it's a good idea or not is another matter. But that portrayal isn't right, so I don't know how truthful the portrayal of the whole Pauline episode is. Read the song Bodies. So you got to take it with a pinch of salt. And on top of that, I told him to his face, Steve Jones, he said, what? I said, you've got a shocking fucking memory.
I have to say, I talked to the guy Anson who played Johnny a while back. I thought he did a great job as Johnny.
I mean, John moaned about it more than anybody else, but I thought he came out of it quite well, to be honest.
Yeah.
And I thought the guy who played Malcolm was very good. I think the one, that whole court theme, he got the way Malcolm spoke down.
Yeah.
Very well. And I thought the woman who played Vivian had a very particular accent down Welsh, kind of weird, kind of slightly northern accent from the middle of the car, and she was in some, was it Shropshire or something? Yeah. And I didn't realise at the time, I did meet her briefly, I didn't realise she'd been married to Elon Musk twice.
Yeah. Yeah, that's it. Listen, it's a brilliant book, Glenn, and I'm just a massive fan, so thanks for talking to us. Really appreciate it.
All right,
cheers.
thank you. Thanks.
See you, man. Bye. Bye.